Hi, and welcome to the Storied Human. I'm Lynn Thompson, and today I'm really excited to introduce my guest, Kristen Swinehart. She's got a cool name and she's got a cool several professions, um, and we're going to find out all about them today. So, welcome, Kristen. It's so nice to have you here.
Oh, thank you, Lynn. I'm excited to be here.
It's rare that I have somebody who's done so many different things. So, what do you want to start with? Why don't you start with I think the most interesting part of people's stories is often like how they transitioned, how they figured out, to move from one thing to something very different. And for you, you really did move into something very different. Can you tell us a
Yeah,
little
first
more
of all,
about that?
sure. First of all, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing that I'm the only that person that has so many, so many backgrounds. And I used to say, I used to be embarrassed because I had done so many things in such a short time, and I was like, my resume does not look good. But now,
I
now it's
think it's a
like,
total positive. I think it just shows
yeah,
somebody who's really engaged in life and really interested in lots of different things. That's how I take it.
yeah, great. Well, I'm glad because I do have a lot of those. So, well, I would say the first big experience would be being an attorney. So, I grew up with parents too. Both my parents, my mom and dad, were lawyers, and so I kind of thought you went to law school. Like a lot of people think you just continue on to college. Um, and so, like at 5 years old, I already had this plan that I was going to go to be a lawyer, and then I started that because I really wanted to work in sports and entertainment. But then I ended up getting out in the real world, and I worked with an NFL agent for a little bit, and also did wills and probate. And so when I got down the wills and probate path, I was like, "Ooh, I sure do hate this.
Oh
Like this
no.
isn't this isn't fun. Like I'm not anybody's agent. Like where's all of the glamour? It was not that at all. And I don't know. It just became like very early on. I was like, this is not what I'm meant to do, or like, there's got to be something more. But I really should rewind because one of the big turning points was that my dad actually passed away when I was 18. And I couldn't understand. I was like, so we live and then we die and that's it? Like I was confused at 18. And then when I got started to practice law, I was like, so wait a minute, now we live, I work this job I hate forever, and then I die. Like this path makes no sense to
Wow.
me. So I think that that was really part of what made me like decide that if something wasn't working for me or it didn't feel right, like I just couldn't spend all my entire life because I knew at the end, like life seemed too short after my dad died. So I practiced law for a little bit, and then I had the opportunity to manage comedians in New York City. So I went to New York City and did that. That was fun. Um, and learned a lot, and living in New York City for 2.5 years, like that's an experience in and of itself. I'm from a very,
Mhm.
very small town in Ohio. Um, and then just had a bunch of different sales jobs and tried all kinds of things, but there was always something that was missing. Like I was like, all right, well that was good, but like there's got to be something more. And so I've continued this path of always looking for something more, and that's why I just kept moving until I've kind of found more of it, I would say now.
That's cool. And I respect that. And it does make so much sense that you lost your dad so young that for you it was a reality that we go sometimes before anyone's ready to have us go. And for a
Hmm.
lot of us it's not a reality. When we're young, we're just like sort of invincible and we think we're going to live forever. And I know people that still have their parents and they're much, these are people in their 50s and they still have their parents and they just think they'll always have their parents and they've always had their parents. But if you have to go through that so young, that's something that that most young people don't know. And so it makes sense that it shaped how long you were willing to stay with something you didn't like. But also that grief really informs you. I think going through something like that so young, that's intense. I read about that the grief really had a part in how you saw things. And that's like such a painful experience to go through at any age, but you were young.
And I mean, how many people actually know how to even handle grief at an older age? So can you imagine at 18? Like I had
No,
no clue. It's not like you
I
go to a
can't.
class in school. They're like, hey, this is what happens when like somebody dies and you go through grief. And nobody's grief is the same. So I just did not have the tools on how to handle that at all. And so I think the work that I do now, I have a better understanding of like what it is and how to support people through that, because
That's so good.
there's no book on like, hey, it's cookie cutter and this is the process.
It's so true. And we're not taught that grief can take a while. We're not taught that it comes and goes. I mean, I lost my mom when I was in my early 40s. And, still it's not 18. I mean, it's not the same, but it was very shocking. We lost her, in a very shocking way. And I had little kids, and I just wasn't ready. And I didn't know how. Like, I didn't know how. And I had complicated grief. I talk about it on the podcast because I think it's really important for people to understand that it's different for everyone. And that I wanted to warn people that if you tend to get depression, if you lean towards that, if you get depressed and you're grieving, it's called complicated grief. And it's really, it can stick with you. And I had to go to a therapist and I learned a lot. I just really felt so lucky that I came out of it and I had good support at home. But I never knew you could be that sad. I remember saying to my husband, I can't believe I'm this sad and I'm still alive. You know, it's like a
Mm.
whole other level of sad. And nobody warned you and nobody tells you. Now, there's some good books and there's some programs that I've seen, but I also think mediums like yourself provide such a comfort. And I've gone to several good ones and they have helped me so much. Even with my pet, I recently went to a medium who focuses on pets too. And I can't believe how much comfort I got. So yes, and yes. But yeah, I wish we were a little more open about how devastating grief can be and how you can be fine and then something happens so that reminds you and then there's a wave. It's just, if we realize that's how it is, then we're sort of ready for it. We accept it, but nobody tells you. It's like, no, no, this is with you. This is something you carry with you.
And isn't it
Anyway,
interesting because it's probably one of the few things that everybody will go through at some point in their life.
that's
Like
what kills
nobody
me.
gets away from grief.
We all have it, right? It's so nuts. It's very true. And it's funny, I saw It's a Wonderful Life. I watch it every year. And I noticed when George loses his dad, he wears an armband, like a black armband around his suit arm, outside of his suit. And I guess people did that then. And I was like, what a cool thing. Like, we've given up some things that would tell other people, be gentle with this person. They just lost somebody. Like, that was another feeling, like walking through your regular, events after you lose someone. It's so invisible that you're in this like state, right? And you're walking around, you're shopping, you're talking to people, you're going to classes, probably you trying to act normal. And if you had that armband or something that let people know, be a little nicer to me. I'm in a certain, it's recognizing the state of grief, that you're in this state. I thought we shouldn't have given that up.
Yeah,
Anyway, I'm
that's
getting off
interesting because
topic. But
no, no,
anyway,
you never know.
but it really shaped you. And it gives you like extra compassion too for other people.
Oh, totally. And I look now, my dad's been gone longer now than the time I had him alive. So I had him for 18 years and he's been gone for 25. And so talking about like waves of grief, like I still have moments where I break down and cry and I wish my dad was here. And, like, how is that even possible? Because, you think about, yes, people that have had their parents for 40, 50 years, but I've had the reverse and still like such a big part of me. But I will say like mediumship and learning that I can connect with him in a very different way now has given me a lot of solace. And I believe that that's one of the things that's given me a lot of the questioning and keep going to try to understand like death and what happens and what else goes on, because that's part of what has given me peace, or at least a better understanding. And now when I work as a medium, I can understand what people could be going through and how just a little bit of closure or just a little bit of like, okay, maybe they are still here, just something that gets them to hold on and understand that like they're not like gone forever. It's just they're showing up in a very different form now.
I think that is so incredibly comforting. I can't even tell you what it's meant to me, especially somebody connected me with a friend who committed suicide. And I was just so grateful. I was so grateful to know that she was okay and who she was with and her state of her state of mind on the spirit side. It just, I didn't even know how much I was like holding my breath to hear that news. You don't
Hmm.
even know until you hear it. And so that's a gift I think that mediums give us. And I think I really respect what you do. And
Thank
we,
you.
we all need more knowledge about that. We got to stop thinking like, I think you get trapped in your grief if you think the person's gone forever when they're not. They're just in another, you know, reality. They're in another. whatever you want to call it, dimension or
Right.
whatever. So how did you start letting that happen? Like, how did you transition? Did you, first of all, was there any inkling that you had this gift before when you were younger?
No, never. I had no idea what a medium was. I didn't know any of
Oh,
this, what people would call like this, like woo world. Like I had no clue. I've been like very logical left brain. I say for all my life, but that's probably not really true, right? Like I just would like be like, oh, I'm logical and left brain. That's kind of the story that I like associated with. But you know, like after losing my dad, I just kept going on this personal development journey that I didn't even know I was starting on. You know, like I started with one course and then that was interesting. And then I started reading books and you know, it's like the rabbit hole just keeps getting longer. Like the more you go down it, the more like, my God, it goes forever.
I know,
There
I
is no
know.
end. There is no end to the rabbit hole. I've
There is
decided,
no
you know.
end. No, it's true.
It's like once you go down there, you're never coming back. I promise you. um, you find a lot of interesting things, but it does. It never. You never come back to where you started from.
That's so interesting. And what strikes me too is you were raised by two very logical people or had logical professions, two lawyers. And so, of course, you thought you were logical and right brained, you know?
Yes. Yes. Well, yeah, logical and left brain, but yes, and
Roughly, yes, right.
But now I kind of wonder, you know, like I like to go back and think if I could ask my dad questions about what was really going on, like how did he see himself? Like, was he logical? But I also think that there was this right brain side of him because he was very good at his job that I was like, only somebody that was probably a little more tapped in could do his job as well as he did. So
Interesting. Yeah.
yeah. So I don't know, but I'm thinking there was more to him than I actually like. Now I'm like, oh, it makes a little more sense. But so yeah, through the rabbit hole, then I ended up doing some work with a Peruvian shaman, and through that work was a bit when I was at one of like these ceremonies, and then discovered I had information about a friend's grandmother that I shouldn't know, or like I wouldn't know, you know, I just wouldn't have this information. And so when I asked him, I'm like, does this making sense for your grandmother? And he was like, yeah. And I think it was something obscure too, like she always liked to wear this red dress, or like, you know, it was like something very random. It wasn't like,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and so that's a pretty good one.
Oh my
And
gosh.
so then I talked with the shaman and I was like, well, do you think that I'm a medium? And by this point, I finally understood what a medium was. He was like, yeah. And that was about as much satisfaction as I got out of him. So left to
Yeah.
my own devices, you know, like, okay, well, now I don't know what that means.
Whatever.
So I started just, again, like researching and learning more. I actually took like an online class from a woman who was a medium who was very high up in the Navy at one point. So I was like, okay, I can relate to her. Like, she's not so far out there that I'm not going to believe anything that she's saying. And that was essentially the start. And then I started practicing. It was during COVID, actually. So this was only within the last 5 years that I discovered that I could do this. It's not like, you know, I saw dead people since I was 6 or anything
Right.
like that. You know, it
Right.
hasn't been like that.
That's so
Um,
interesting.
yeah. So now I look back and I can see things where it's like, I'm very strong claircognizant. So I have a clear knowing that claircognizance means like clear knowing. So I would know things that other people didn't know, but you don't know. I didn't know. I knew things other people don't know.
That's so interesting. I asked that very specifically because now that I look back and connect the dots and knit things together, I realize I was always psychic and I was always intuitive and I was always spiritual and I didn't get it. Like you just said, you didn't know that you knew, like I always had ESP with my mom and I would always like answer her questions that she didn't say out loud. And we just laughed about it like, oh, it's one of those little things, but there were so many other things. And when you start to put it all together, you realize actually the shamanic thing is another connection that I get because I took two shamanic classes years ago, one with my husband, Celtic shamanism and Huichol shamanism, which is in Mexico, the Huichol people. And I just couldn't explain why I felt like, yeah, this is where I belong. It's just this connection to the whole ancient sort of wisdom thing. I remember saying this is like psychology but better. It's like
Mm.
healing rituals and psychology, but it's more than 100 years old and it's all over the world. There must be something to it. There has to be something to it. And I journeyed with both classes, especially the Celtic shamanism. I journeyed and got all kinds of answers and learned all kinds of things. And that really shaped like how I look at everything. And it's so cool that you have that too, because I just feel like it's all connected. I really do. Because I feel, shamans go to an alternate reality. And I believe, mediums do too. And so there's
Right.
all kinds of like supposedly levels or whatever. I don't understand all that, but it's really kind of connected for me, that this kind of going beyond this dimension and receiving information. And it's not out there at all. I mean, I feel like it's, magic is just science we haven't discovered yet, what people call magic, or it's, we just don't, we're starting to understand it. People keep talking about the quantum field and how they
Right.
have a feeling that that's where psychics go because there's, they can see the quote unquote future, but there is no future really, right? They go
Mhm.
beyond time and space. And that's where healing happens too. That's where shamanic healing happens. And so there's this whole idea that maybe someday physics will explain it so that people won't think it's so nuts. There's just not that everybody does, but just I'm seeing a change. I'm sensing a change that there's a little more science backed explanation of like meditation and healing techniques. And I think there's some serious stuff on mediumship. I saw some film called Beyond Death or something like that, where
I
they're
think I
really
saw.
taking it seriously and trying to, study it and interview people and try to understand near death experiences and try to put it all together. And I think that mediums help people feel so much better because, again, you don't want to stay stuck in your grief and think someone is gone forever. You
Yeah,
want
no,
to know.
absolutely not. Yeah. You want to know that there's something else, or at least like understanding that they're, I mean, and I know that sometimes people will be like, oh, they're in a much better place now. It's like, well, those are kind of words. I mean, you know what I mean? Like a lot of people don't believe, they're like, yeah, well, I don't know if I, like, that doesn't necessarily help somebody in the middle of their grief. Oh, they're in a
Everyone
much
says
better
that.
place
Yeah.
now.
And
But
by the
like if
way,
you could
they
actually,
said, I wore the red dress, remember me? And like that's how they validate, right? And I love you.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Like, so something like that. And of course, when I do my work, it's very important for me to get evidence, like, that they have whatever that may be.
I love that.
Um,
Yeah.
because then it's like, okay, like how, there's no chance I could be making that up. And
Right.
that to me, that's part of the fun part. I mean, one of the fun parts of what I do for me too, is that I'm always just as blown away too when I'm like, okay, well, why am I talking about that they got Wendy's Frosties? Like that's so obscure. And then they're like, oh my God, my dad ate Wendy's Frosties every day. Like, it's like, oh, okay. So for me,
It's
it's
so
kind of
awesome.
fun. It's fun to
That's
see what
so
the spirit
awesome.
world will give you. So
So
that that's,
you seem really comfortable with this. Were you a little afraid when it first started, or were you afraid to open up to it?
I feel like I probably would have been open to it sooner if I hadn't been afraid, because I don't know that I didn't know what I had growing up. I've always just thought that I was like the weird kid that didn't fit in, but it's
Me
like
too. Yeah.
I had I had friends in lots of different groups, but I never really felt like I belonged, and I couldn't understand why. And I think that's one part now that I'm finally all these years later like coming to terms with, was like maybe I wasn't like the weird. I mean, yes, maybe I was weird. I'm a weirdo, whatever, but it's because of what I can do. But why do I need to be ashamed of that? Because a lot of
Right.
people come to me very interested in what I do. And so
Yeah.
I think that it was always just feeling like I was out of place and not understanding.
Yeah.
Now that I'm like seeing people's responses, and, like, for example, the other day I was at my apartment building and there was a guy in the pool who had an experience with a medium. And he said to me, never having worked with me before, like, wow, I think it's so cool what you do. And it's a really important job. So keep doing what you're doing. And I'm like, wow, this is so crazy. A stranger is like acknowledging
So
me for this.
wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is
Um,
so great. I
yeah.
feel so strongly now that I connected some dots of my own that if I'd been raised in a tradition like the Celtic shamanism teacher, she's a sixth generation druid. She comes from a line of Scottish shamans. And so she was raised with this stuff and she was, trained and she was taught that this is how you do it and this is okay and you're not weird. I feel like if we had something like that, we would have known earlier in our life. I really do. I feel like there was nobody in my family to support. Usually there's a grandma or something. Like if you're living in Europe and you have this tradition in your family, there's a grandma or a grandpa that will teach you. And you will know when you're young that you're not weird and it's not odd. It's just special, and you'll be trained in it. So we found it later that I actually was told I was a medium by one of my psychic healers that I interviewed.
Well,
And
that doesn't
I'm gonna
surprise me. I
I'm
would have
gonna
guessed that
follow.
about, well, I wouldn't have guessed. I would have thought that. He's not
Aw,
guessing.
I'm gonna follow up with her because nobody's ever said that before. But the shaman thing, definitely, I definitely connect with that. But I really feel like if you'd had that grandma, you would have been on the path sooner. I feel like we don't get validated so we learn to be, normal, quote unquote. We learn how to play normal.
Yes, that's true. And at the same time, like, could it have been something that like needed it happened the way it needed to happen?
Maybe.
Like because
Right.
how different I if I would have realized this a long time ago, I probably wouldn't have gone to law school because I'd be like, well, I'm not logical left brain. I've got this a whole other thing. But I have found that a lot of times people will listen to me about my mediumship because I've given them some sort of credibility because they think, well, if she's a lawyer, then like, so
Well, there you go.
it
Maybe
gets
it
people to
happened
go, wait, what the heck?
just the way it's supposed to happen. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
so cool. That is so cool. So you've been doing this since like 2020 or
Correct. Yeah.
yeah.
2019, at the end of 2019, I discovered this. And so then of course COVID happened. And then that's when I was like, well, I guess I got some extra time to get on the phone and try this out with some friends and see what happens. And then I went, started doing that. And it's not really practicing because you're doing it, but and then people started paying me for it. And I was like, wow, this is really something.
Isn't that
So
cool? And does it
yeah.
get easier? Like, do you feel a little more confident after as time goes by?
Um, I mean, yes, to an extent, right? But
Yeah.
I also think that when you're dealing with something where, and this is one of the reasons I love doing this too, is because I don't like, back in the day, if I were going to like practice law, I had to like prepare what I was going to say and do all of the things. Now I just show up and just trust the spirit's going to give me the words to say. So I'm like, well, there's no real preparation, although I do meditate and do everything else, but it's not like I have to,
Yeah.
sit down there and prepare. And when I say that, like I do a lot of group readings. So
Yeah.
I go stand in front of a group and then do my readings that way, but it's not like I know what I'm going to say. I just have to trust that spirit's going to be there. So there is that piece like, all right, well, let's hope spirit's there and I'm getting what they're telling me, so there is
Oh,
always that factor, but, but I do trust that spirit shows up when needed.
I love that. So there's a trust thing, and that's really what you have to have. And I'm so intrigued that somehow spirits know we're there. Like I've always been so amazed by who comes through and how they can tell. It's almost like you make a date. I remember last time, well, the time that my mom spoke to me, um, she had spoken to me earlier. I had been to a group thing up in Connecticut, and then I was going to go to another group thing, and I let her know. I was like,
Mm.
I'm making this appointment with you. I was like much more like aggressive about it. I was like, I'm going to be there. I hope you will be too. And I was like meditating and picturing her and smiling. And she came through and it was so cool. And I was like, how do they tell? Like, I'm just so curious about the other side of what it's like. And I got to tell you a really funny story. When I was in Connecticut, we were getting this read. There were like maybe 10 of us, right? And this is a pretty famous medium. I didn't even realize it at the time, but she's, been on TV and stuff. And she's so genuine. I loved her right away. And so we're sitting there in this older house. My friend lives in this old house. And we're waiting for her to, receive a message. And she goes, oh, wait a minute, wait a minute. Someone, and she explained it as a line of people. She had a line of spirits, right? In order. I was so intrigued by that. And she said, oh, but wait a minute. There's someone that just wants to add something and they're not related to anyone here. And I'm like, what? She said,
Who invited them?
and she said, oh, they used to live here and it was a speakeasy and they wanted to say hi and they wanted to tell you about the house. And it was a speakeasy and it was all crazy and it was a prohibition and people would meet here. And like the timing was correct. The house was from like the 1910s, and it was like, I guess it was 29 or something they were talking about, but it was so cool. And everything they said checked out, like the history of the house, everything. And my friend hadn't lived there long. She didn't know it. She didn't know that history. And it was just so validating to start it with that. And then
Yeah.
right after that, my father-in-law came through and he was a very devout Catholic. And he showed up in his altar boy uniform. And then he showed up in his military uniform so that I would know for sure that it was him. I just thought that was so cool.
Yeah, and the way that they show up and like how you remember them. Like I was talking to somebody, I said, I don't generally give physical descriptions because that doesn't necessarily help somebody because they could have like they could remember their loved one at like maybe at the end of their life when they looked a certain way, but the way that usually a lot of spirits will show up is like when they were happiest, so when they're like
Yeah,
lively
yeah.
and had dark hair and all of the things. So sometimes it's like, they will show us the things that we will remember them by, not things that you could get confused.
It's just so cool the choices they make. So I was like really I was in awe that night. First of all, that the person, butted in front of everybody and told about the history. I thought that just sort of validated the whole thing, right? I was like,
Yeah, that's
whoa,
great.
I was really impressed. So have you had any really surprising moments or have you had any like really, wild moments that you've read for
Hmm.
people?
I mean, I would say almost all my readings, there's something that comes through where I'm just like,
Yeah.
whoa,
A little
so
surprising.
there,
Yeah.
yeah. So I'm trying to think like, well, there's one that, and it's funny because my brother, like
Aw.
we'll talk about some of these things, but I think we're in a different place with it. But there was one story that I told him that he brought up not so long ago that I think was such a great one. It was a reading I did really quite early on. And um, it was about a dad who came through and he had a signed baseball by Mickey Mantle. And the dad was trying to tell the family not to sell it. And I had no idea that the family was actually in the process of debating on what they should do with the baseball or not. And so I was like,
Whoa.
well, there's this baseball and he's saying not to sell it. And they're like, oh my gosh, that's crazy because my son is wanting to sell the baseball. And
Oh
so
my gosh.
like that came through. And there have been things like that. Oh, I do have another one. I did a reading for somebody else and she wanted to connect with her grandfather, who she was very close with. And I brought him through, and he told her, tell her mother that she and her sister needed to start talking again and get back on good terms. And so she went and told her mom that. And then she reached out to her sister, and they got back on good terms, so good that they actually ended up buying beach homes next to one another and like now have a totally different relationship. So those are the stories that I love hearing, like the after, like what happens after when there is something like that that changes the family dynamic, or there was some message that, solves the problem, or, so that's the part that I really enjoy is seeing like what happens.
I love that. I love that there's helpful messages that your loved one is still concerned about you and still knows what's happening. That's
Yeah.
amazing to me.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too is like, your loved ones still know what's happening and what's around. Because sometimes I think people also question, like, well, if only my mom were here to see this, or only if they're there, they're seeing it,
They
And so
are.
sometimes the
Oh, they are.
messages are just to come through to let people know, like, what was I was describing one time somebody's wedding dress, this woman, and she's like, oh my gosh, I was connected to her grandmother, but I was describing the wedding dress. And the woman was like, but how would she know that? And I was like, no, she's letting you know that she saw you in your wedding dress. And I like
She did
described
see it.
exactly.
Aw.
Yeah.
So to me, that's just so comforting. And so it it lets people realize it really is that way, that you're not lost from each other, that you are
Hmm.
still connected. I'll tell you one of the most powerful things that came through for me, and you would think it would be my mom, but it was so like it was so expected. What my mother said, she's just like, I'm really proud of you and I'm so much happier here. Don't worry. And the person that pulled her through said she's very zen right now. She's very peaceful and zen. And she suffered so much at the end of her life that this was such a gift to me. But the most surprising thing that a medium said to me was about my friend who committed suicide. I remember feeling really wrecked by that for a really long time. And it wasn't that long after I lost my mom. And it was only, a year and a half later, I lost my friend. And I'm in the car and I'm thinking of my friend and I'm really upset. And I called out to her and I prayed for her and I sent her out loud. I prayed for her and I said, I really miss you. I hope you're at peace. I just felt like this urge to do that. And then a few years later, I'm at the medium, not even thinking of this friend. And she came through and the medium said she heard you pray for her.
Oh, wow.
She thanks you for praying for her. And I was like, okay, I totally believe now because there's always a little bit of doubt. I said, I totally freaking believe now because I was alone in my car. Nobody knows I did that. How could she possibly know that unless all of this is real? So that was a real moment for me.
Wow,
And
that's awesome.
I was very touched. And I tell people all the time, please talk Talk to people that you've lost. Talk out loud because they hear you. And I
Yeah,
do it all the time now. I do it all the time. I always did it with my mom because I was so close to her, but I do it with my dad too. And there are some days where I have like a longer commute. I talk to every person I've lost. I call out every person I've lost because I miss them and it just makes me feel better. And I know
yeah.
they hear me. I know they hear me. And I want people to know that they hear you.
Yeah, I think that that's important that people understand that they hear you. And the other thing too is that they don't really like they're not going to intervene when you need help. Like a lot of times they want, I mean, they will, but like they want you to ask for it too. Like sometimes it's like, if I could just get some help, but nobody's here, or like feeling like you're alone. But then when you understand, like you can ask them for help and they're wanting you to ask them for help. And then that can support you as well. So I
Oh,
think
that's
sometimes
so cool.
it's easy to feel like, oh, I'm so alone. If only I had the people around, or they're still there. You can't see them, but ask them for help. They want you to.
I love that. And that's true with angels, right? You have to ask.
Yes. Yeah. It's like, and that's the thing. Like I was reading where it's like, if there's like something like major that's going to happen, they will intervene in order to prevent, something really terrible. But like, if it's like, I'm really struggling today and I sure could use some help with whatever, like it doesn't really matter, but just call on them and
Yeah,
ask for it.
I love that. Now, you just recently started channeling an angel, right?
Yes. Archangel Raphael.
That sounds so intense to me. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, especially when I didn't know who Archangel Raphael I was like, yeah, so I
I'm
was
not
actually,
big on my archangels. I don't I don't
I don't think most people are like, oh, yes, I remember. He's the, yeah, I was actually at a retreat about a year ago. And through that experience, there was a medium, the facilitator, she was a medium as well, and brought through that I could channel Archangel Raphael. And I'm like, okay, well, what does that mean? And who is he? And what would that entail? Logical mind kicks in all of a sudden, like, well, that sounds like a big deal. Um, so I then learned that he's actually the Archangel of healing. So energetic, physical, mental, emotional, he can help with all areas of healing. So during that experience, um, I was like, well, I guess let me try and see if I can do this. I don't really know what trying to channel an archangel is like, but let's give it a shot. And so I like invited him in, and then I could really feel physically my body, like my arms were moving up like really big wings. And then I started to talk in a voice that was not my own, which was really
Whoa.
crazy because I could hear it, but I was like, I've never heard this voice come out of my mouth before. And then what I was saying was like super interesting. Like I was like, these are not Kristen Swinehart words. These are like something else. And so there were a couple other women there. And so they like witnessed the whole thing. And one of them had actually was a nurse and had like her finger was kind of cut and she knew that like she was going to need an antibiotic. Well, the next day she came down and was like, Kristen, like my finger is totally better. And she's like, there's no way that that would have gotten better on its own. And so I was like, wow, well, that's pretty wild. So that's when I had like the first experience of it. I haven't really been able to like channel back in that same voice. Part of it's because like I felt like I was in a safe environment in order to like
Yes.
have that
Yes.
experience. It's a little bit different when I'm like sitting in my own apartment, like, all right, let's like bring this
Isn't it?
angel through
I
and see
know
what
it's so different,
happens.
right? There's something about being surrounded by like-minded people. Yeah, it's like a little
Yeah.
different. Yeah.
However, I am able to like channel his messages. It comes through my own voice. However, and it rhymes. A lot of times it rhymes. So that's how I know it's not me
You
because
mentioned that. I was so intrigued by that.
yeah, it's kind of the craziest thing because I sound like Dr. Seuss all of a sudden, I'm like speaking in rhymes. Like never in my life have I even like thought I could put a rhyme together. Like I'm definitely not a poet and I know it. Um,
But that's so intriguing. And so, but
yeah.
that's kind of how you know now too. Like that's a distinctive quality of it, right? You know
Right.
right away.
Yeah.
It's rhyming. It
Mhm.
must be him.
Yeah. So, I'll bring like again, I'll do like group work and bring these messages through that kind of speak to the audience. And then I will ask for people at the end of the experience, like, what did you experience? What's some of the feedback? So I can start to understand like what's happening. And people will say, like, well, whatever you were talking about was like so point on. I was like thinking about that thing or something specifically. Or I'll have people say, like, I could feel like energy coming through my body, or so there's a lot of different things that people experience, and everybody's experience, of course, I believe is going to be different because you don't know what is like the healing that they need in that moment. And then I've had things like when I've worked one-on-one with people, I've seen things that have happened in their life that I wouldn't have known. And then I
Yeah.
bring that information back to them and say, do you understand this? And they're like, oh yeah, so It's very
That to
interesting to
me,
me. All of this
I
is
just
interesting.
well, I love that again, I just have this feeling like we just don't understand how everything's really connected. We don't. But like we can see as you're doing your work that it really is. And we just, it's just science that we don't really understand. It's just all connected. It's the way the universe works. And I love that you found this because this talk about a calling. This is this is your calling. It's so special. And I'm just so glad that you're able to offer that because it's a gift.
Oh, thank you. Yes. And there's one other piece I should point out that Archangel Raphael also helps with travel. So if you ever get like nervous
Mm,
flying or, you can call on Archangel Raphael, which, ironically, of course, I'm a flight attendant and like was like, oh, how
I love
funny is
that. I
that?
love that. That's so neat. I love that. So is there anything else you would like my listeners to know that we might have not mentioned or
I think that one of the things that's important that I like to share with people is that if you have any like inkling, nudge, whatever, think that you might have like a sense of intuitive ability, we all have it. It's like trusting it and leaning into it. So knowing that you have that as well. And if I can come from a lawyer and being very logical to embracing channeling an archangel Raphael, like, what else is possible for everybody? So I just like to
I
maybe
love
say,
that.
like, maybe if you have a curiosity or a question, just maybe start to follow the breadcrumbs or tune into it because you don't know what it can lead to. I mean, that never, 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 never would I be saying, like, yeah, I'm going to channel an archangel. Like, it was just not in the realm of possibilities for
It
me.
was
So
not
I
on your
just,
to-do list, right? Oh my
no,
gosh,
I've
that's
had a
so
long
cool.
one. I've had a long one. That one was
That
not
is
on
so
there.
cool. So can you tell us how to get in touch with you? I'll put it in the show notes, but I want to, some people don't read the show notes. So I just want to make sure we include like how to get in touch with you.
Sure. I am now, I've just changed it to this because it really resonates with me. Theflyingmedium.com on Instagram, the flying medium. And also that's theflyingmedium@gmail.com as well. So I'll have a couple different ways to get in touch with me. But yeah, thank everybody for listening today.
That is so perfect. Thank you so much. I love talking to you.
Thanks. You too.